I am joined today by Lawrence. It is Lawrence Levy or Levy?
Levy, Lawrence Levy, yeah, but yeah.
Right, who is an author of, now, usually whenever you see like a chat show and you see the host say, oh yes, I read your book, and I look at them and I go, Ellen, you haven't read that book. You've had an intern give you notes on that book. Lawrence has written a book a few years ago called Pixar and Beyond. And not only have I haven't read it, I've listened to it on Audible because I like to multitask. I read it, and just to kind of sort of show that, it literally led along Audible to me to go down a wee bit of a rabbit hole to then read Creativity, the Pixar Touch, How to Be Like Walt, Ride of a Lifetime, Disney War, the Disney Story, and basically get sucked in to this time from very different angles of this, well, literally incredible story about Pixar and beyond. Lawrence, could you just give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and the book in question?
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's really great to be on the show and great to meet you. So myself, so as you know, I started out as a young lad born in London, England. That's where I was raised. And then my family immigrated to the United States in my late teens. And through a long series of moves, I ended up out in Silicon Valley in my mid-20s. I came out here in the mid-1980s. I was actually a lawyer at the time. And I was one of the first lawyers to be practicing in this tech world, is the new field of high-tech transactions. I actually created the very first legal department that specialized in high-tech transactions at the biggest law firm out here in Silicon Valley. And I did that for a number of years, and then I ended up going to work for one of my clients, a company called Electronics for Imaging. It was a startup at the time, and we actually were able to take that company public, and that's where I really cut my teeth on the inside of startups, although I'd been working for a lot of startup companies for a number of years as doing their strategic alliances and transactions. And this gets me to like the mid-1990s, and then I'm in my office one day, and this is where my book starts. I received a phone call. I literally picked up the phone, and I hear this voice on the other end of the phone that says, "Hi, this is Steve Jobs. I saw your picture in the magazine a couple of years ago. I thought we might work together someday. I have a little company I'd like to tell you about." And I thought that company was Next Computer, which was the company that Steve famously started after he was fired from Apple. It was his sort of revenge company to get back at Apple. But it wasn't. He said it was Pixar. And I didn't really know anything about Pixar at the time. And as the first chapter of my book is called, as you know, Why Would You Want to Do That? Because everybody I knew told me that would be just a career-ending move to go work for Steve Jobs at Pixar at that time.
Absolutely, because again, it was the time where he wasn't kind of the revered savior of Silicon Valley as he is now.
The opposite. I think he'd had at that point about 10 years of a string of failures, beginning with the last couple of computers that he'd done at Apple, the Apple Lisa, the Apple Macintosh. Pixar was intended to be a computer company. They made a computer called the Pixar Imaging Computer that had sold like 5 units. The next computer had been a failure. He was really being written off. I think it was the lowest point of his career, and Pixar was being written off too. But as I often say, joining a startup is as much an act of naivete as it is vision. And so that's probably what happened to me at that time.
Excellent. And then obviously the book goes through the story of Pixar going to basically have to call up Steve Jobs and say, we're going to need a bit more cash, and then going into the IPO in 95?
Yeah, well, I wrote the book because I realized of all the books out there, none really captured the Pixar story the full way I remember it. Pixar has such a vaunted, brand and reputation in the world. People sort of think, it sort of sprung up as this storytelling utopia, where people are making these magical films year after year. And in many ways, it is that, but it did not spring up as a utopia. It was a company, much like the Walt Disney Company a couple of generations before, that was literally on the precipice of failure, the entire time. And there were many more moments when we thought it wasn't going to make it than it was going to make it. I mean, I just give you one small example, which is that one of the earliest and most fundamental decisions that, kind of we made, and that I sort of realized as a CFO, doing the business planning for the company, was that Pixar needed to become an entertainment company. And you kind of think to yourself, well, wait a minute, like, how we ever thought of Pixar other than an entertainment company? But no one thought of Pixar as an entertainment company in the mid-1990s. It was a graphics computer technology company. Steve never refused to hire animators for Pixar. They had to sort of sneak them in the back door. And there were good reasons for it. Steve wasn't interested in the entertainment business. He didn't buy it, to do that. And it was a sort of a terrible business to go into. Besides which, you'd never hire me to run an entertainment business because I didn't know anything about it either. But it was quite a process. And from the financial and CFO point of view, it was quite a process to kind of get to that conclusion, both strategically and financially. So that's an example of, deciding, wow, we have to become something that we don't even know anything about. And so we literally had to learn that business in order to sort of move Pixar in that direction.
When you joined Pixar in the kind of early mid-90s, was it very much off the bat, this is going to IPO in the next few years? Was that kind of the approach that you took?
Yes and no. Yes, because that's what Steve wanted. And no, because after I got into Pixar, when I saw that things were much worse than I imagined, I realized that IPOing it was going to be close to impossible. Because the business risk, every element of Pixar's financial sort of makeup was anathema to what public investors look for. And so, public investors, they like straight lines. They just like, predictability. They like curves that go up and to the right. They don't like bumps along those curves. The animated feature film business is the opposite. It's hit driven, revenue. You have a good year, then it goes like this, it goes like that. It's extremely risky. One miss on a film could stifle your revenues and profits for years. And I realized that this was going to be investors were not going to take to this easily. And I as a CFO, I went to talk to, at the time, he was my former boss as a lawyer, Larry Sonsini from the Wilson Sonsini firm. It was still is, the number one firm in Silicon Valley for doing IPOs and that kind of stuff. And I knew him well. And I remember I went to him and said, no, they're just not going to buy this. I said, people are not going to buy this story because the financial story is so difficult to explain. And he knew me well. And, he said, look, regardless of Steve's enthusiasm, he also knew Steve well. He said, you just got to disclose it. You just got to be, just put it out there the way it is, and you'll see. If people take it, they will, and if they don't, they don't. And this played very well into my own philosophy of doing financial transactions. People worry about disclosure a lot, especially CFOs, right? They sit on the cusp of disclosure, and when you have to disclose things that don't look so good, it doesn't feel so good. I always had the opposite view. To me, disclosure was my best friend. Because what disclosure does, it says, this is your problem. I'm the one that's going to sleep well at night because I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just going to take everything and tell you everything, right? And now you decide. And if you want to invest in this company, it's on you. And I've taken that attitude with sort of everything that I've done in business and in investments. And that's exactly what we did with Pixar. So there's Steve, he's going out saying, we're building the next Disney company, which is fine. You've got to show the vision and the dream and all that. And then there's me coming, yep, we're building the next Disney company, but this is the reality of the financials of that. And as the book showed, as you know, it was a very rough ride to get Pixar financed through the public markets. We did pull it off, and it was the thing that enabled Pixar to flourish and succeed. But a lot of those disclosures did scare people away.
That when you're on the road show with Steve, I'm thinking, this is it did almost seem, as you said, he's out there saying something, you're like, right, I need to come out there with real stats and figures. Yeah. How did you? The entertainment industry, as you said, is very much hit and miss. How did you find that stakeholders cared about things such as revenue management and the impact that would have when getting it listed?
What we did to sort of counter this volatility kind of thing is that we had put, and I go into this in some detail in the book, as you know, but we put together a business plan, that had these sort of what we called these pillars of success. There were these like 4 or 5, pillars. And, we did not make this stuff up. We spent a long time on this, to come up with exactly what it should be. And we were able to go out and say, look, this is a really high risk bet. But if we pull off these 4 things, there's things that we have to do. We have to renegotiate our revenue deal. We have to raise a lot of capital. We have to build the studio. We have to duplicate our creative quality. We have to build our brand. They were very specific and very articulated in detail. If we pull off these things, we will build, the next great franchise in animated and family entertainment. Each of these things might be close to impossible, but that's what we're going for. And I think the fact that we had so much resolve about that, so much confidence that this is what we needed to do, that those people that did come on board kind of bet on our ability to do this. And in fact, there was one financial analyst called Hal Vogel. He's still around. He was the top financial analyst in the entertainment industry. He now does other industries, but he and I eventually became quite good friends. But he told me that when management shows that kind of resolve and confidence and makes investors believe that they really have a shot at pulling that off, it really makes investors happy. And so that's the way we counted the volatility part.
Let's talk a little bit about Silicon Valley. Now, it does seem to be, IPOs are very much seen as the exit strategy. But especially again, going back to, I'm going to keep going back to the book a lot, but going back to the book, that almost seemed kind of the end of like chapter 1 in many ways, or the end of act 1 was the IPO. Do you think that's kind of something that's taken a lot of tech firms? It is all about getting public and then that's it? Or what's your kind of take on exit strategies and IPO?
Well, I've always seen and still see the IPO as a beginning, not an end, especially if you're a CFO. Because life changes once you're public. All of a sudden, it's just you and your little family and your little, group of people. But, once you're a public company, your accountability goes up, enormously. And, I always say, like, the people that are investing in an IPO, they're investing so that investment goes up. For those people, for those investors, it's day one. And in a way, as management, you're working to some degree on their behalf. So if it's day one for them, it's day one for you. And so, I always take the attitude that, an IPO is an exit strategy for those who are liquidating stock that they've held in a company. But for management, and especially the CFOs and their teams, IPO is kind of a beginning more than an end. That's how I've seen it.
And CFOs, you guys are just like what, glorified accountant? Is that is that right? Could we talk about the role of the CFO outside of kind of the accountant, but accountant. By that I mean accountability, outside of the kind of accounting side of things in terms of running the business.
Absolutely, yeah. So I have a particular take on this as well, but I would say as well that this take is sort of tailored for what I would call like innovation companies. So companies that are, and that could be big companies or small companies. It could be a tiny startup or a huge company. But if the goal of the company is innovation, excellence, dream building, the kind of stuff that Silicon Valley is famous for, but many companies all over the world, then I think the CFO in that kind of company has a very unique role. Because the startup companies or large companies that are trying to, have breakthrough innovation, they live on the precipice of two things. On the one side, there's the dream, the vision, the hope, the idealized. We're going to sort of make the world better. We're going to make better products in this space. It doesn't matter if you're making animated feature films. It doesn't matter if you're making the next great fintech breakthrough. It doesn't matter what it is, but you're trying to break through. To break through and innovate requires a lot of dream building and energy and inspiration and all that. And the other side, there's the practicalities of it, right? The practicalities, the fundraising, the profitability, the cash, right? Cash flow. Cash is king, right? You can't run out of money. And so the CFO in those companies, in my mind, lives right on or should live right on the edge of that precipice. It's an opportunity to be a person that is keeping one eye on both sides, right? One eye on the practicalities, the money, right? The stuff that we need, but also on the dream building. So this was huge. Pixar is a great example of this because obviously the creativity at Pixar, innovation at Pixar was everything, right? You're trying to make films that will entertain people the world over. And there are many things that can crush that creative spirit in that world. And as a CFO, I sort of learned that, wow, I have to push this company towards, a profitability, cash flow, all of those things without killing that spirit. And that required me to develop a great sensitivity to what it took to generate that spirit. An example of this would be, something like as simple as how often are you going to make films? In Pixar's case, this was one of the biggest issues that we faced. When I joined Pixar, it was making Toy Story. It had 200 people working on it. It takes 4 to 5 years to make one film. 200 people make a film, right? Then they stop making the film, then they make another film. So every 4 or 5 years, you get a film. Well, there's no way you can build a business releasing a film every 4 or 5 years. You've got to increase it. So we had this huge, months-long discussion. How often could Pixar make films? Would it be every 4 years, every 3 years, every 1.5 years? As a CFO, I'm like, you can't make them often enough. Twice a year, a summer release and a winter release. But quickly you come to see that if you push on that too hard, you'll dampen the creativity that's needed to make a great film. Because as I learned in that business, stories, I'm like, just make films quicker, instead of 5 years, let's do it in 3 years, let's optimize this. But I learned in that business that stories, they take time to percolate. They cannot be forced. You can't force creativity. There's a certain organic kind of life cycle to it. That was that particular business. So I had to be very sensitive to that and push the company to sort of do more, but not killing that. And that was a process. I believe that kind of process is where CFOs in innovative companies bring tremendous value. And the best ones are ones that are sensitive to both sides. And so that's why I think it's a great role and a really exciting role, that you don't have to be just always the numbers guy. No. Yes, you have to be sensitive and focus on the numbers, but also the strategic and creative side. Mm-hmm.
Very, very well said. Do you think that's something that is completely cross-industry and cross-time?
Yes, if what you're trying to do, see, if you're just managing a business that's been around forever and you're just like, you're in maintenance mode, then it's sort of less important. But today, most companies are trying to innovate. So whether you're a fintech startup or in any field, and when you're trying to innovate, you're definitely going to have the cross currents that any startup has and that we had at Pixar. You're going to face cross currents because the problem with, like, if you're just producing, I don't know, widgets, right, you can control everything. But the problem when you're trying to innovate is you can't control innovation. By its nature, it's not going to just sort of lay down and go according to your timetable. So I think what I described before is true across all fields where innovation is a priority.
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about the middle way. But this is a very kind of unusual in finance. But I found this kind of interesting that in many ways, on one hand, you have, I've completely forgotten the guy's name, the guy that friends with Donald Trump and runs Marvel Entertainment, Ike Perlmutter.
Okay.
You have Ike Perlmutter and Jeff Bezos, who are notoriously quite frugal, almost a lot of abstinence from excess in many ways, especially during the early Amazon startup days, in the pursuit of a long-term goal. And then on the other hand, you have the likes of the ones that are lampooned in the TV show Silicon Valley, the likes of WeWork, which is nothing but sensual influence. Do you think there kind of almost needs to be a middle way for company culture?
Well, for sure. The middle way, as we might or might not get into, but my book is called To Pixar and Beyond, and the and beyond part is just a very little thing at the very end of the book, because I eventually went off to study philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and I had, for a lot of reasons, moved my life in kind of a different direction. That's what a lot of these books behind me are about. And the central philosophy that I've studied over those years happens to be called the middle way, and in the world of philosophy, it has some very specific meanings. But the middle way, in a kind of a nutshell, is a philosophy of harmony, and it says that we flourish as human beings, as organizations. We flourish better in harmony than when we're out of harmony. And when we're out of harmony is when we spend too much time on what would be called the extremes. And so the middle way is saying push off of extremes if you want long-term flourishing. And so that's the essential element of the middle way. And so, but in the context of businesses, I put it this way: a couple of extremes that you can think about, both in business, by the way, and personally, is that on one side you have what I call the bureaucratic function. And this applies to organizations and it applies to us as individuals. And the bureaucratic function is basically the function that says we're just here to get things done. Our function here is just to build, to acquire, to measure, to produce. We don't care about anything else, just that. And so we're focused exclusively on the numbers, on being frugal, and all of that. That's all we care about. That's the bureaucratic function. On the other side, the other extreme is what I would call like the free spirit or the artistic, function in life. So the free spirit, the artistic, is not interested in how to get things done, but is interested in experience. How do I experience life with joy, with harmony, with connection, with community, with all the things that make us feel good, make us flourish. And what the middle way would say is that if you're stuck in one of those extremes, some result will happen that is not to your liking. So if everything in life is bureaucratic, right? Everything is about getting things done, about counting and measuring and this and that. You may amass a pile of stuff, trophies or wealth or money in the bank, whatever, however you want to measure it. But you also may wonder, wow, did I ever really live? Was I just amassing stuff? If you're stuck on the spirited side, the artistic side, you might smell the roses occasionally, so to speak. But you also may lack momentum in life and become frustrated by that. So people, individuals, businesses, organizations get stuck in these places. And Pixar was the reason I ended up putting this in the book, is because Pixar was an example of a company that really did navigate its way to the middle. It was able to have enough bureaucracy, enough administration, enough capital, to sort of have the ship flourish, but without killing the creative spirit. And I think this model for, so for example, you talk about, Amazon, which you've never been there, so I'm not intimate with it, but they certainly have this reputation for, bureaucracy and efficiency, but they also have this reputation for, it's a really, really harsh place to work. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly I've read articles and the books have been written about it. So for my mind, the organization of the future, the organizations that will flourish, do well by their people, do well by their customers, are ones that find this, are sort of brave enough to kind of navigate their way to the middle.
Very, very well said. I wanted you talk about that obviously with Pixar. I want to talk about acquisition time. So Disney acquires Pixar, and my impression of it is that Disney acquired Pixar's culture, and that then spread to the rest of the organization. Do you think that's kind of a fair assessment? Talk us through those kind of years there and kind of maintaining that culture at Pixar?
Yes, I think that is a fair impression, actually, and it was very, very deliberate. And so Pixar reached a point where, it at the time it had a dozen or so incredibly successful films. Its stock was flying extremely high, and I was the one who kind of said, look, when the stock is flying high like that, and you're in the animated feature film business, you're really exposed. You're really out there. Because if you have a film that misses, which surely one day will happen, you can take a huge hit. And so the thing to do at that point is you sort of should diversify the stock by taking that high stock price and investing it in other companies, or you sell to a company that will pay the high price and allow you to diversify, basically into its collection of businesses. And so we talked through all of that. And at the same time, something happened that was really pivotal, which is that Disney had a change of management. Michael Eisner had been the CEO, and he was essentially let go because he, through a mini coup of sorts, because it was felt that he had let the animation sort of business go, and that Pixar was number one, DreamWorks was number two, Disney had slipped, and the board wasn't happy with that. So they brought in Bob Iger. So the question was, well, where was Bob Iger going to be on animation? And so we started to meet with him, and it was very clear that he wanted to rebuild Disney in animation. And so that acquisition was actually all about infecting Disney with Pixar's culture rather than the other way around, and this was expressed in openly and in detail. So, and I don't think the acquisition would have happened without that. So when it did happen, that was exactly the idea, and it was unusual at the time, but it really worked. It worked so well that my own view is that not only did it revamp Disney in animation, but the acquisition was so successful that Bob Iger then went on this spree, right? Right, and he buys Lucasfilm and the Avengers and all this stuff, right, that has led to what's now the modern Disney. But Pixar was the first of those acquisitions in the Bob Iger era.
One of the things I love about the financial services space at the moment, that's a weird thing to say, but one of the things I love about banking at the moment is in all markets of the world, you've got incumbents. You've got Wells and Bank of America in the US, you've got HSBC and Lloyds and NatWest here in the UK. And they're sprung up all of these challenges. Monzo and Starling are the big ones in the UK. Wise as well, who I think I emailed you about. And then in the US, you've got the likes of Chime and Faro and Up, which are these new banks that people absolutely love. I always remember in your book is one of the things that I always use an example as a Walt Disney Plus, when you were talking about selling shares but having them as collector's items because of the animated characters being on them. And I thought that a Pixar share with an animated character on it, that's a perfect example of kind of plussing. Similarly, the likes of Monzo have done crowdfunding. People have gone all in on them, and kind of they want to have their cards saying investor. It's a similar thing in terms of how passionate people have got about their banks. Do you think that these large incumbent banks should look to acquire these kind of smaller ones? And if so, what would be the advice to get that culture across these big, very suited organizations?
The challenge for the large banks is that the inertia that they have is enormous. I mean, I've used Disney as an example with Pixar. Every day we just couldn't understand why Disney didn't just crush us out of existence, right? They had infinitely more resources. They had the market access. They had everything, and they could see everything we were doing. It was like, I'm not kidding you. It's like we literally they're going to do it. We're just going to wake up one day and they're going to say, okay, they're in now the computer animation. We don't need Pixar anymore. And I think what happened with Pixar and Disney was rare. And a lot of credit, to Bob Iger on sort of allowing that to happen. But I think big organizations vastly underestimate what it takes to move their culture to be like those small ones. And I'm actually constantly telling, businesses like, have you ever even paid attention to your culture? Do you even know what your culture is? Some people have told me, I didn't even know we had a culture. Because they're just so used to it. Like, this is the way we do things. But culture is something that seeps into every detail. How we speak to each other, how we work together, how we set up meetings. It is literally in the details. So I think for large organizations to remake themselves is a great idea. Because otherwise they will, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It may take 50 years, but they'll lose momentum. So they need to remake themselves, but they underestimate it. So if they could really acquire some small companies, really let that culture come in, it'd be a great idea. Much harder than it seems, and they need to recognize that.
I think it's not as simple as just buying something on a checkout.
No, not at all. And they have to take a good hard look at their own culture. There's an example I often use, and I think this is one of the topics we wanted to touch anyway, is the way people work together, collaboration. So collaboration is an art. And it's one of those things, like if you ask a room full of people, like, are you a good collaborator? Are you good working with other people? Everyone's hand will go up. But if you ask and say, well, I'm not going to ask everyone to say if they think you're a good collaborator, right? You get a totally different result. And the way people collaborate in small companies and large companies is extremely different. And so I often say that collaboration only requires two things. You have to get the right people and you have to listen to them. All you have to do to collaborate is get the right people and listen to them. Just turns out that those two things are very difficult to do, especially in large organizations, but often in small ones as well. Steve, and working with Steve and myself as well, we sort of had this view that when you have a problem to solve, the right people means the people that are only the people capable of solving that problem. When you have a problem to solve in most organizations, oftentimes people will go, who should be there? Who needs to be at the table, right? And then the answer is suddenly about politics. Well, this person ought to be there or they'll be upset. Or this person ought to be there because they're a senior. Or this person ought to be there because they're a manager. All of these politics come into who should be in the room. Steve and I as well never paid attention to that. It didn't matter if you were the lowliest person in the company or the highest person in the company. If you didn't have something major to bring to the table, you weren't going to be in the room. And so you've got to get the right people together. The best example of this at Pixar is the single biggest decision that an animated feature film company makes is creative decisions over its films. Is this the final version of Woody? Is this, what are these characters going to look like? Is this film good enough? I mean, it's endless, right? It goes on and on. In Hollywood, generally speaking, the executives are involved in that. But Pixar, we looked at that and go, well, wait a minute. The executives here, Steve, me, Ed Catmull, we don't know anything. We're not very good at this. There's nothing special about us. We don't have skill in making creative decisions over films. So we don't need to be in the room. Now, that decision didn't come lightly. It was a lot of thought. I'm sort of summarizing it for you now. But we literally took ourselves out of the room. And we were never in the room when the biggest creative decisions of the company were being made. So there's an example. Sometimes you have to pull yourself out of it. So that's the right people. Second part of collaboration is listening to them. And that's even harder. Because everyone will think that they're a good listener until someone critiques what, they have to say. And then we get very defensive. We used to say the cliche phrase, leave your ego at the door, when you come in to solve a problem. And of course, we may be well-intentioned and we'll take our ego out and put it at the door. We come into the meeting. But as soon as someone, critiques us, the ego will drill through the center of the earth and come back up and be there in a defensive mode. So it's not easy to listen to people. Steve and Pixar were extremely good and made overcoming that problem into a high art. And this is something I think people don't quite understand as much as well about Steve, because in Steve Jobs you see this sort of mercurial character who's lording over everyone and making decisions and really strong and not interested in what others has to say. So he wasn't like that. He was really strong. He had incredible conviction, incredible intensity about his beliefs and convictions. And he was often the smartest guy in the room. So when he did think something, it was valuable. But one thing about him that I think people understand less is that he was much more interested in getting to the right answer than being right himself. Mm-hmm. And that distinction is everything. So an example is that when Steve believed something, he believed it with biblical conviction. But I was never moved by conviction. To me, conviction is a bad argument. It's not an argument at all. It's an emotion. So it has no weight in trying to resolve something. So all the conviction in the world doesn't make you more right or more likely to be right. And so I would just be like, well, we need to look at this side. We need to look at this side. And we had this tremendous collaboration. And I think that this is really important in cultures that are trying to innovate, is this spirit of collaboration where you really know what it means. Put the ego aside and let's all get together and figure this out. Because this problem, I assure you, whatever it is, whether it's fintech or anything else, is bigger than any one of us. And let's just put all this nonsense aside. And Pixar and Steve were really good at that.
But that's the thing, because when people think of Steve Jobs, they do think of... I've always been more of a fan of Pixar Steve as opposed to Apple Steve. Unlike yourself, I didn't know him just from reading. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people kind of gravitate towards that? The Apple Steve.
Well, because there's three Steves. There's a pre-Apple, pre-Pixar, the original Apple Steve, the Pixar Steve, and then the Apple Return Steve. And people remember Steve as the original Steve, the enfant terrible, from Apple, which he was. He got fired from Apple for, it's not easy fire. It wasn't easy firing Steve Jobs in the 1980s. He was the founder of the company. But I think, and this is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, that Pixar had a big effect on Steve. A real big effect. A couple of things happened. One was that he was actually in an industry that he didn't know. And so, that was humbling for him and humbling for me. I mean, we had to learn it. In the computer industry, he was top of the world. But in the entertainment industry, we were absolute, neophytes. And the culture at Pixar was not going to be the culture at Apple, the original Apple, or the culture at Next. So Steve had to go through kind of a metamorphosis. Like when I joined Pixar, one of the problems was that the company lived in fear of Steve. He was like the absentee landlord that nobody ever saw or knew. And they were afraid that when he came in, he would destroy this sort of creative culture that they had made. And I was the agent for him to do that. And so it was kind of rocky, at the beginning. So, but he learned, how to, run a creative company like that. So by the time he got back to Apple, he had a whole new experience under his belt, from Pixar, both learning how to be a different kind of CEO and also learning the entertainment business. And so post Pixar, Steve was different, but that's sometimes not recognized.
The last thing I wanted to bring up was CFOs today. Do you have any kind of last broad stroke advice of what CFOs today need to be focusing on, need to be thinking about?
Well, I'm a big fan of the CFO role, as I said, because of the reason I said before. The CFO sits at the precipice of all the things going on in a company. Because they've got the great ones. They've got one eye on the financial side, and they've got one eye on the strategic and the creative and the business side. They're the person that can help be an agent, a catalyst for bringing these things together. The challenge in most companies, always, and today in innovative companies, is that there are tensions within companies that pull against each other. Like there's tension always, like between sales and revenue and engineering and product making, right? The product is never good enough for the sales, whatever it may be. Even in the film business, there was a phrase that says, your film is never finished; it's just shipped to theaters. So the creative, the technical things always want to do more, fix more, right? And the sales and the revenue is trying to pull it in another direction. The CFO is the person that can really be a catalyst to pull these forces together and shouldn't sort of align with one side. So I'm not a fan of this notion that the CFO is the numbers guy or the numbers person. To me, if there's a numbers person, maybe it's the controller or the financial staff. I mean, there's certainly people whose job it is to focus on numbers. But the CFO should see themselves as bigger than that, broader than that, as the person catalyzing health within the company by trying to get all the forces within the company aligned and working together. That could include the CEO and everyone else. And because they have an eye on all sides, the CFO is in a unique position to do that. And I think today, especially, companies really need that because business is more complicated. Regulation is more complicated. Tech regulation is more complicated, and it's more complicated by country. And so, but I think that's how the CFO should see themselves as sort of the fun adult in the room. kind of a thing. Not so serious, but also, willing to sort of make the hard decisions. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be, but when I hire a CFO, I'm going to be like, you need to be the fun adult in the room. That's a great description.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.